us onto the second issue we'll look at very quick, which is the global energy crisis. And the global energy crisis is very important because something major happened on 10th February. Russia announced that it would cut production by 500,000 barrels per day. Now, the global oil production last year, 2022, was 100 million barrels per day. So it's just 0.05% shortfall in supply. But it comes at a time when the International Energy Agency predicts a record demand in 2023. And so what we are seeing is rising demand and lowering supply. Now, of course, shale oil production went up. In fact, the Energy Information Administration tells us it went up by 75,000 barrels per day, and shale oil will be a record 9.36 million barrels per day, which is all good for the US. The US is now energy independent. The US is largely insulated. It has got oil, it has got gas. But the rest of the world will suffer enormously because very simple mathematics, demand will exceed supply. And this means that inflationary pressures will remain stubbornly persistent in the global economy. In fact, The Economist, its most recent issue was on inflation. Now, this has implications for Europe. In Europe, the strains will grow. German industry is already suffering. It is paying 40%, or it will be paying 40% more for energy in 2023 than it did in 2021 before the war began. This is a huge increase in costs. In fact, German papers have already talked about Mittelstand becoming Mittel kaputt. We covered this in an earlier episode, in an earlier analysis. In northern Italy, deindustrialization is also a real fear. There are two big areas of industry, Germany and northern Italy. Both are suffering enormously. The UK already is in political crisis, has been for a while. Inflation has stubbornly remained above 10%. With such inflation, the will to fight is likely to weaken. Already we are seeing the election of people like Giorgia Meloni in Italy. She's a far-right leader. Hungary, of course, Orbán is back, and he's far more sympathetic to Russia than most leaders. The UK is in perpetual crisis. We'll see what happens. The next election is, I believe, 2024. If we move east, India and China, they'll be in trouble too, because if the supply goes down, it is very clear that their discount will decrease and the cost of oil will increase for both the Asian giants, which means that there will be inflationary pressures. And this is a critical time for the leaders of both India and China. In China, the credibility of Emperor Xi Jinping and the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, will take a hit. People have suffered enormously because of Xi's asinine zero COVID policy. And they will now, this year, suffer inflation. Similarly, Prime Minister Narendra Modi of the Bharatiya Janata Party faces elections in 2024. If there is inflation, if the price of onions rises, then his chances of re-election, or re-election with the same majority, at least, will diminish. So this is not good for either of those two leaders. If we talk about the Global South, and the Global South is a term now used for developing countries, emerging markets, or the poorer part of the planet. And the Global South, we will see an increased food, fertilizer, and fuel crisis. We've talked about this a lot, and I won't throw too many numbers right now at everyone. But what I'll say is that since 1789, history has repeatedly demonstrated that revolutions depend on the price of bread. In Asia, of course, probably the price of rice too, because most people in East Asia are rice eaters. And if these go up, staples go up, then regimes will wobble. The regimes that come to my mind straight off the bat are regimes like Lebanon, Egypt, Sudan. Of course, Pakistan is already in trouble. Sri Lanka has seen crowds invade the presidential palace. And so the multiplier effect of inflation, first increase in oil price and then the resultant inflation, will lead to massive trouble. There's another number which we should bear in mind. According to the International Monetary Fund's global debt database, overall borrowing has jumped by 28 percentage points to 256% of the GDP in 2020. This went up further in 2021 and 2022. And government borrowing accounted for half of that increase. Public debt now is about 40%, and this number is dated. So this is more than 40%, I'm sure, for 2022 of the global total. This is the most in 6 decades. And oil price increase, or the oil price is staying high, and inflation staying high, and therefore interest rates staying high, will cause pressure on this debt. Servicing this debt will become unaffordable for the poorest countries. So we are looking at a real specter of sovereign default, of the basket of goods and services people consume on a daily basis increasing, and a real risk of a bubble that happened over the many years of very loose monetary policy, thanks to quantitative easing, which was to stave off the 2007-2008 financial crisis, global financial crisis, turning into a depression from a recession. And then, of course, the fiscal spending, government spending a lot of money during the pandemic, during the COVID-19 pandemic, to basically avoid a lot of poverty and hunger and misery, that leading to building up of debts. So the combination of loose monetary policy and indisciplined fiscal policy led to a bubble. And we might be seeing that bubble burst. The pinprick of the Russia-Ukraine war might have far more consequences than people imagine right now or factor in.
Yeah, well, all the points you make are valid. I think I perceive the depth of the threat as less, or the likelihood of depression, global depression, as opposed to recession and real problems, perhaps is less likely, but than your perspective would intimate, but not to be dismissed at all. I think you touched upon the 3 critical issues that are at play and that we can't know the future about, really. And there, you talk about debt, inflation, and then you refer to the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which really is the thumb on the scale, or whatever analogy or metaphor you want to use, affecting the global economy and then the fates of nations. And we don't know how that will play out. However, real as all of those trends, factors, pressures are, there's a more positive story at the same time that's occurring. Now, the data I have is dated, but the trends, when there's current data, I am certain actually will be more positive even than the ones that I'm saying. The data I have comes from the middle of late 2021, and I don't have data for 2022. The International Energy Agency, hardly a Pollyanna progressive institution, although one somewhat more favorable to the fossil fuel industries than some analysts might want, has increased its forecast for global growth of wind and solar power consistently. Every forecast they make over the past 5 years has been increasingly bullish, and yet proven to be substantially too conservative. So each estimate that they renew becomes more and more optimistic about the real possibility of not just marginal improvements in energy production globally, but earth-changing improvements.
I mean, on that note, Glenn, I don't know, a week ago, you saw that report on the more positive side that China exported about 3.63 GW of solar wafers and 2.38 GW of solar cells in 2022. And these were up 61% and 131% year on year. This is just spectacular growth.
The growth in renewables is, new technologies are sinusoidal, as we'll know, and we're in the exponential growth part. But the improvements in technology, reductions in cost, amount of energy being produced, all are, in every instance, are exceeding the most optimistic assessments made. To the point, not just that it's good for those industries, but actually fundamentally changing the energy production mix for the globe. The renewable energy market update forecasts are 40% higher growth than just 12 months before. And that was in 2021. The data for 2022 will be another at least 40% higher. Renewables now account for over 90% of new electricity generating capacity globally. That was in 2021. That would be even more so in 2022.
Now, that is all, sorry to interject, that is all true. And these trends will, of course, increase both in production. I'm sure there'll be greater energy and efficiency too coming in. Houses will become more efficient, and houses are terribly inefficient in America in particular, of all the advanced countries compared to Europe, and even cars or public transport. But what is also true, Glenn, sorry to be a bit of a Cassandra, is that 15 African countries imported more than half their supply of wheat from Russia and Ukraine in 2020. So whilst, let's say, Europe moves to a more green mix, in America, of course, with its technological prowess, really takes the lead in developing green and clean energy. And so does China when it puts its massive scale to the test, and hopefully India as well. But what happens to these 15 countries in Africa? What happens to the countries in the Middle East?
Well, they're at the end of the tether, so the effects will be greatest as the world spins progressively out of control, perhaps. But that the far greater than anticipated improvements in global energy production and costs and sourcing leads us to the surprisingly happy, in a relative sense, news with regard to inflation and even unemployment globally. Inflation is coming down. It remains too high, and forecasts are that it will probably remain higher than central bankers would like for a couple of years, but coming down more quickly than had been feared. Similarly, unemployment, certainly in the United States, but elsewhere, the employment levels, that's a better way to put it, are more robust than feared, because so far, surprisingly, but not definitively, Ukraine has not collapsed as much as feared, and the war has not been, in an economic sense, globally, as catastrophic as feared, which doesn't unsay or counter your points about what's going to happen to the hundreds of millions of people in the poorest countries in the world. But the underlying trends, the stresses that would lead to global economic disaster, inflation, unemployment, and debt, have been less bad and actually more good since February 24, 2022, than we had feared. Now, all this could change literally in a day, depending on the course of arms in Ukraine, where also, from my perspective, certainly happily, the trends are more positive than all of us had, and certainly I had publicly assessed was going to occur 12 months and even 6 months ago. So I'll just give one or two examples to end this point. In 1973, with the first oil shock, energy prices quadrupled. And I remember, some of you also listening will recall, lines at the gas stations in the United States, half a mile long, a kilometer long, people waiting for hours and getting into fistfights at the least because there was no gasoline. And inflation, it stopped global growth. The glorious years from 45 to 73, it ended it. The growth rates have been durably lower since then. And for a decade almost, inflation was substantially higher. But the comment at the time was made, it is impossible for an economy to reduce its energy use by 33%, which is what our recommendation was. In fact, that was quickly exceeded. So our estimates, just as they were too conservative about the capacity for the economy to become more efficient, where they were too conservative in 73, similarly, it appears that in this Ukraine war-induced and pandemic-induced crisis, perhaps the data is indicating a greater capacity for rapid transformation than we had feared only 12 months ago.
All right. Well, just quickly, the war, the Russia-Ukraine war, one little nugget, and then we move over to the Adani saga. And two little nuggets of information are important. The Russian economy, as per the International Monetary Fund, shrunk by 2.2% last year in 2022. The prediction was it would shrink by 8.5%.
The Chinese can be altruistic.
Yes, indeed. The prediction of the IMF was it would shrink by 8.5%. So the Russians outperformed the predictions. And in 2023, the estimate is that despite the production cut of 500,000 barrels per day, BPD, they will actually end up growing their economy by 0.3%. That is the IMF estimation. Now, the Ukraine's economy, on the other hand, shrunk by 35%, despite $46 billion in economic aid and $67 billion in military aid by the US. So the Ukrainians are not doing so well in this war of attrition. And my big fear is that the longer the war goes on, the harder it is for Ukraine to keep it up.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.